This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your home for investment, economics, and geopolitics. For our publications and archives, go to goldnewsletter.com. This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host here. Privileged to be with you each week. And we have a unique guest, Roman Skaskiw. I have him on because I think it ties into an earlier theme we addressed both last week and earlier with the renegade third worlder Raul del Toro, and about maybe the libertarian movement growing up, becoming fractured, different perspectives on what we do, our information we share. And this man has particularly unique insights on foreign policy. Roman is an ex-Iraq war veteran, so a retired member of the U.S. military, grew up in New York about 5 years ago or around 2010. A bit later, I'm not sure, he'll clarify. He decided to move to Ukraine, and he's been living there, and he watched the Russian takeover of Crimea, and he has been an outspoken critic. Now, this is why I've been following him, but let's just say first, I'm glad you could make it. Thanks for giving us your time.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
The articles that drew my attention, and many people at the time probably saw this. It got a lot of traction. Putin's Libertarians, when your former Libertarian hero calls you a Nazi, 9 lessons of Russian propaganda. So Roman, by being in Ukraine and being in the military, had a better sense for what was going on there and for the media coverage. Now, you felt... let me read just one quote from you here, from your first article, Putin's Libertarians. I have been horrified by the libertarian coverage of events in Ukraine, which presumably provoked you to write about it. So what horrified you so much?
I thought libertarians were going to celebrate what happened in Ukraine. I thought this was the template for overcoming an oppressive government and discrediting them and getting rid of them. And Ukrainian society paid a very high price for doing that. A lot of people were killed in the protests. So I thought it was going to be like, wow, how did Ukraine do it? What lessons can we learn? There's hope for liberty. It was a feeling of ecstasy here. Like we threw off old Soviet ghosts that still had been haunting us.
Actually, just back up there, because many of us do not know this. I'm not sure whether you want to call it a revolution, but what actually happened prior to the Russian engagement?
Okay, sure. Just the facts. There was a President Yanukovych. There were protests against some political moves that he did. There were very brutal crackdowns against those protests, including they started killing protesters. Rather than discouraging them, the protests grew bigger and bigger. The center of Kiev was occupied full-time. The whole thing stretched on for several months. In the end, people within the protest camp started getting shot by snipers. So not just at sort of the line of contact between police and protesters, they were shooting deep into the camp. And people sort of charged out of the camp and returned the aggression. I think all told, 100 protesters and 14 police were killed. And the police said enough is enough, and the police abandoned their posts, and the president fled the country, and a new regime came to power. So I think that's a very neutral way to put it. I thought there was going to be celebration among libertarians. I thought this was a great move for the cause of liberty worldwide. But the propaganda, even before it came to a head, the protesters were all Nazis. The protesters were all sponsored by globalists. And it just never stopped. This was an aggressive NATO assault against Russia, and the propaganda never stopped. So I thought it was being framed incorrectly. I thought it was part of a big history of things being framed incorrectly when you come here to the East. For example, in Georgia, we libertarians have relatively few things to celebrate. It's mostly bad news. We can probably celebrate Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in China in the 80s. But there was another great success in Georgia, another Russian neighbor, in 2007 and 2008. They made huge anti-corruption reforms. They fired all their bureaucrats. Can you imagine that? Like all the bureaucrats getting fired, an entirely new police force getting put in place because they were so corrupt. So that was another like great move for liberty. And which we should have all known about and celebrated and studied and realized that such reforms are possible, except it was followed in 2009 by a Russian invasion. So I think this is the pattern. You know, if there's a move towards liberty in Russia's sphere of influence, it's going to be slandered and rebranded very aggressively. And there's a second pattern in play, which I cover, I think, pretty exhaustively in the Lessons of Russian Propaganda, and that's their how aggressively they build ties with dissenting political organizations in the West. There's one interview with a former KGB agent, Yuri Bezmedov, who even built ties with the Transcendental Meditation movement in California. They want influence everywhere, and they use that as their mouthpiece to get talking points out. For example, the protests in Ukraine are all Nazis.
Yeah, well, let's try and clarify. So, right now, I mean, a corollary, which I've been following closely, is the Venezuelan uprising. There is a criminal and brutal regime which also has been firing upon protesters. And
yes.
So I guess you would say that in the Ukrainian case, the police, they abandoned their posts, and this could have been a relatively liberal democracy flowering. You just thought that for some reason that message didn't get through.
Yes, I mean, well, I think it did get through, and I think it's there. But I was just shocked by the disinformation that was out there. I hope it got through. I'm so close to it that I'm not sure exactly how it's perceived from further away.
Sure, that's the problem. I mean, it's hard to know what to believe, of course, when you are so far away, which I was at that time. When we're talking about a few years ago, I was in the United States. And the problem is that so many of us, I think, fall into the trap of the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So many of us obviously do not like the federal government of the United States. And so we are naturally suspicious of them. And that plays right into the hands of other worse governments or regimes around the world. Now, but what transpired between the point of this fleeing of the past president of Ukraine and then the Russian intervention? How long did that take?
Well, let's see. The government fled in February, and the attack, the little green men started appearing in Crimea, I believe, in March. Incidentally, there were some awards given out by the Russian president to Russian military units, and the period of the operation specified, I think, even predates the fleeing of the president of Ukraine. So they had this. So the awards seem to indicate that the operation for Crimea, at least its planning stages, started even before Ukraine's president, who was a Russian puppet, even before he fled. But I should also point out that, like, Russia, their methodology is not to try to tell the truth or to convince you that something is true. A lot of their methodology is just to, like, break all the rules. So if Putin says that there are no Russian military in Ukraine, and a month later he said he takes credit, he goes, "Yes, I planned the invasion of Ukraine or of Crimea," that's not considered a bad thing. That's like, oh, he was so clever. Or, for example, they'll declare peace in Syria, or I don't want to get into that. They'll say one thing and act on another. And like in the West, like politicians at least try not to do that. They're extremely dishonest, but lying is like a bad thing. And in Russia, they seem to strive for disinformation, and that dissonance. It seems like a goal of their propaganda. And I elaborate on that in the essay, 9 Lessons of Russian Propaganda.
Let's take a quick break to acknowledge our sponsor.
This episode is sponsored by the New Orleans Investment Conference and Gold Newsletter. For over 40 years, investors have relied on both of these institutions to get timely intelligence from the world's top experts and to discover tomorrow's biggest winners in metals and mining. Visit NewOrleansConference.com and GoldNewsletter.com to learn more.
And these articles fortunately did get some traction. Now, the reason why this came to my attention and to so many others is that, yes, as you mentioned, the libertarian side, because there's a libertarian universe of media, which I guess I'm somewhat a part of.
Sure.
Yes. And you are too. But largely did not get the story right. And that's a pattern I've seen in other places as well. So, for example, even when it comes to Cuba, libertarians seem to be all at sea when it comes to Cuba. They don't have a clue what's going on there, and they will start to blame the United States for sanctions and even become not great, but almost helpful propagandists for the Cuban regime, which defies belief. And so, in the case of the Ukraine incident or the Crimea problem, in particular, one organization, I don't like to always name names, but this one I think deserves particular attention because it has been prominent. It's the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And they've just been extremely aggressive on this and taking the Russian side. That's been my perception, that Russia was just, I guess, supporting some kind of secession movement. So
yeah, I was shocked. Yeah, I know a lot of people who are close to Ron Paul. I sent him personal letters, which apparently were forwarded to him. So I was so shocked, but I was so disheartened by that because, like a lot of people, I gave heart, soul, and dollars to Ron Paul's campaigns, both in 2008 and 2012. That was just a huge blow to my morale when I saw an institute with his name. But I talk about that institute and its director, Daniel McAdams, quite a bit in that trilogy of essays, Putin's Libertarians, When Your Libertarian Hero Calls You a Nazi. Like, it's just egregious, and it's sort of beyond the point where I could think it's a mistake. I don't know what's going on there. I'm disgusted, disheartened by it. He lost all of his Eastern European followers. It's bad and shocking.
You mean Ron Paul lost them, or Daniel McAdams?
That's a good. I mean, the brand went down, so I won't say precisely, but in general, the brand is not what it was. It's not the inspiration that Ron Paul was in 08 and 012.
Right, and I want to confess to some degree that I have fallen into this trap, because one of the reasons why this trap is seductive, perhaps, is that not only is it the enemy of your enemy is your friend fallacy, there is this non-interventionist just dogma, or that we should never get involved anywhere around the world, and for two reasons. One, because it's immoral, or two, because it will not work. And we then, if we start off with a certain just axiomatic dogma, we are susceptible to whatever information available might make that more convenient or might be suitable to that line of thinking. And these days with the internet, there is such an array of, I guess, misinformation available. You can pretty much pick whatever you want to go with. So, for example, this is where you come, where articles from Salon, for example, will start praising Hugo Chavez as some, bringer, some generator of prosperity for Venezuela, or the others will claim that Venezuela's inflation rate is not actually that high because the official rate is that a certain way. And we have to be more careful about, how can I put it, about being precise and about not letting our ideological inclinations blinding us to what is before us. Do you want to comment? You say that, you just said then that it's gone almost beyond just negligence or confusion. You almost think there's deliberate misinformation now.
Yeah, and I think I made that case in the essays, Putin's Libertarians, When Your Libertarian Hero Calls You a Nazi. Like, it's just beyond the pale, some of what was getting put out, especially from the Ron Paul Institute for Peace. But in terms of non-intervention, I try to be very careful in my writing to never call for action. Like, I never wanted anything more than for people to report accurately. So I wrote one essay. They invited me from the Daily Beast. It's not a libertarian, it's more a mainstream publication, but they invited me to write an essay. And in that essay, I called for non-intervention. I said, it was still earlier in the war, but I called for non-intervention. So So, those people who accused me of being a neocon, that's not it. I've never been calling for a war here. I've just been saying, you should speak the truth. And in general, I've recommended that you should treat what's happening here, if you believe in liberty and individual freedom, you should treat what's happening here, like a crime that happens on the other side of town. Maybe it's too expensive, too impractical, too dangerous to get involved. Maybe the guys over there need to learn to stand up for themselves. But, for goodness sake, don't call the victim the perpetrator and the perpetrator the victim. I also want to thank you for what you're doing, because it is a struggle to get to the truth. And I think we're doing it. Alternative media is the future. Just a few days ago, I signed up on Patreon for the first time and donated to several content creators like yourself who are doing this. So I think alternative media is the way to go. That's how we get to the truth. But man, there are so many people who care so much about your perception, especially if you're an American. Like, you have no idea how many people full-time are trying to influence what you think. So that's part of our struggle. If I could also plug a YouTuber who I just discovered. Yeah, he's also part of this alternative media, but he's awesome. He's from Romania. The YouTube channel is called Freedom Alternative. And if you want slicing and analysis of sort of the Russian political philosophy, far greater than anything I can deliver, look up his video, What is Duginism and Why It Matters? What is Duginism and Why It Matters by Freedom Alternative, and you will understand the mindset of the Kremlin.
Well, why don't you give us an update then, what has happened since that time? So what is the situation in Ukraine, and is the Russian march just continuing?
Oh, good question, yes. So I live 300 miles from the war zone in the capital, Kiev. You would never know there's a war happening, except for a lot of guys in camouflage on the streets, and a lot of charitable events have a visible presence, like raising money for soldiers or helping soldiers who've been horribly wounded. So that's the capital. The economy seems to be turning around. The IT sector has never stopped booming. I have a friend who owns a big outsourcing company, and his business increased 30% in 2014, the year the war started. So Ukraine is beautiful. It's filled with tourists. It seems to be booming here in Kiev and in the West. Okay, Crimea. There's an on and off blockade coming with protesters who sometimes think it's a good idea to stop commerce, and there's kind of a debate, should we do an economic blockade? Most of the Ukrainians who are there fled to Ukraine proper. The Tartars, who are a Muslim minority, but have the deepest roots in Crimea, they're suffering a lot of oppression. A lot of them fled to Ukraine. At least a few dozen of them have gone missing, which is terrifying. The economy there I have a libertarian friend there who's a Russian guy, great guy. So he told me, this was about a year ago, that life is better for all the people who work in government because they increase pensions and salaries, but for all the business people, it's much worse. And there are pictures of empty beaches in Crimea where they should be packed right now. Okay, that's Crimea. The temporary border is stable. There's no shooting there. There are military maneuvers occasionally on one side or the other, but there's no shooting there. Then Eastern Ukraine, it's like a war there with trenches and heavy artillery and tanks. The contact line does not shift very far in either direction, but people are getting killed every week. And this month was an especially bad month. I think there have been upwards of 60 Ukrainian casualties, about 10 or 15 KIA. I should have looked that up before the call, but this was an especially bad month.
The challenge for us to understand is maybe the motives at play, because many of us see Ukraine and Russia as just bosom buddies going way back. I mean, obviously we're not so familiar with the history, but that's the perception in the West, that why are these people killing each other? Aren't they just like Australia and New Zealand or Canada and the United States, just, long-term friends? Like, what is the fight over?
Well, let me try to answer that at sort of at the deepest mythological level. The Russian myth is that we're a big sort of Slavic brotherhood. That's their story. And after the Mongols sacked Ukraine, the political center shifted north. But we're all this big brotherhood. Okay. The Ukrainian national myth is diametrically opposed to the Russian national myth. So they have an identity crisis when we Ukrainians assert our identity. The Ukrainian myth is that we've always been here, we've always been a people, and Moscow are invaders, just like the Mongolians have been invaders, just like the Ottomans have been invaders, just like the Poles had imposed a feudal system. So we're on a crappy piece of real estate. We've been struggling for autonomy forever, and the Muscovites, as Ukrainians prefer to, or as Ukrainian nationalists prefer to refer to the people in the north. I'm not anti-Russian. I have Russian coworkers. I co-authored a book with a Russian guy in America, but I have a big problem with their politics. So anyway, the Russians see us as a big brotherhood, and we tend to see them politically as another invader. And in fact, Ukrainian poetry often deals with the idea of a hijacked identity. We think the Tsar Peter I, who was the one that decided to call everybody Russian, we think that they took that name from the Rus people who were here. And one of my favorite poems that refers to this, if I could roughly translate one of the lines, it's, "What are these Muscovites looking for in our torn open grave? Maybe it's an ancient father. If they could only find one, our children wouldn't be crying." So that kind of sort of touches the soul of a Ukrainian identity, which I hope you can see is diametrically opposed to their idea of a big brotherhood.
So they would almost see the Russians as beneath them or as an offshoot as opposed to the other way around. The reason why this is important too is that, of course, not only is there fighting going on there, but this Russian presence, as you said, it did away with the Georgian progress, unfortunately, and it's become such a hot-button topic in the United States. And so this is not going away, and in fact, there may be more Russian confrontations in the near future. I'm not a specialist on where they will go next, but this, and you said, but in order to further that expansionary ideal or ambition, they engage in this propaganda, and it goes on both sides. So on the one side, we have the likes of the Ron Paul Institute, unfortunately, but on the other side, we have the likes of RT America or RT International. I'm not sure what the title is these days, but I've been a guest on that network a few times. Sure. And one reason why it's particularly important is that they get on many anti-U.S. government or pro-liberty people to give their views, including Jacob Hornberger. I think he's been on many times from the Future of Freedom Foundation.
I love Jacob Hornberger, yep.
Yeah, and I asked him about it, and he's a big fan, actually, which kind of shocked me. But so what is the problem with that kind of outlet?
I would urge everyone to watch that video, "What is Duginism and Why It Matters." It's a conflict between East and West, between people who in the West try to tell the truth, and sort of a more Eastern philosophy where words are just another weapon. In the West, we see war as a way to sort of, okay, we can't figure out our problems, so we're going to fight, figure out who wins, and then we'll get on with life. That's the Western conception, more or less. The Eastern conception has a much lower regard for truth. This is completely evident in Duginism. And they kind of see war as never ending. They assume that everyone else is lying, and they just have to do it to keep up. So for Duginism, in Greece, he'll appear before Bolsheviks, hardcore communists, and say, "Unite with us, we support you." In Chechnya, they'll talk about the long history of Muslim-Russian relations. I think his words were, "Islam is an organic part of the Russian whole, so support us." He'll host a nationalist conference and say, "Russia supports you." He'll host a libertarian conference and say, "Look, we understand how America is cracking down on you. We support you." But it needs to be exposed as a chameleon. And they're not even trying to hide this. Like he literally, Dugin is sort of the ideologue of the Kremlin, very influential. He's also founder of the Nationalist Bolshevik Party earlier in his career. But he's explicit that we can believe whatever we want for the current political project. So it's just saying what's useful now to expand influence. And that's what needs to be exposed. And that's what comes across so beautifully and exhaustively by YouTuber Freedom Alternative in his video, What is Duginism?
Yeah, well, I want to add too that in one of my interviews with RT, this is before I really understood what they were all about, and I was just glad to get some coverage. I said something like, well, we have corrupt politicians in the US just like we have in Russia, and I started to say something about Russia, and right then they said they had connection problems. It was really weird, as though they just had certain words would trigger them.
Yes.
Just no, do not let this guy continue. so
Yes.
So I think people need to be...
I was joking with a former Belarusian politician who had to flee the country, as I understand it. And we were talking about what a great libertarian outlet RT is in the U.S., and we were joking that the U.S. should open like a libertarian channel in Russia.
Well, people should look at which other channels, too, that RT works with. And particularly in Latin America, their communist streak, shall I put it, is much more overt. So this really saddens me. People like Abby Martin, this rising journalist, got taken in by Telesur, which is the mouthpiece of the Cuban and Venezuelan communist regimes. I think it's just such a tragedy that someone like her would go and work for them. And this has happened, of course, with RT. There are lots of these pro-liberty types. I mean, they just don't seem to see a problem with getting paid by these regimes to be reporters, and they don't realize they're being co-opted. Okay, man, you've given people plenty to assess. Now, what's the best website for you? You've got a couple up there.
I do. Roman in Ukraine. This whole conversation is sort of become less important to me, so I neglect the website now. I'm focused more on my career, but I do post there regularly. Roman in Ukraine. That's probably the best one. I also do book reviews on YouTube, Roman's Book Review. And the most important thing, the way I think we're going to win in the long run, is just independent content creation like yourself. I'm really optimistic that in the end the truth will be known.
What a pleasure, and I hope we get to speak again soon.
Thank you for having me.